Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today's video is the third and final one in our short series on fencing schools of the Renaissance era. In part one, we talked about the arrangements and organisation of schools. In part two, we covered training methodology. And so today's video is about the actual people in the school. In other words, the students and the teachers. Let's get started. So let's start by talking about the students in the fencing schools. In period English, they were simply referred to as scholars for the most part. In some Italian texts, they were called giocatori or players. The scholars in fencing schools seem to have been divided into a kind of loose hierarchy. So new scholars were only permitted to train with the instructor or under his personal supervision. More experienced scholars, sometimes known as free scholars, were permitted to train freely with the general body of students. The most experienced and senior of the attendees at the school may have been designated as provosts. So provosts were essentially assistant instructors who helped out with the teaching of the lessons and supervision of the other students. These do seem to have been loose grades. There's no indication of any formal examinations being taken by the students. And there weren't any uniforms or coloured belts or anything like that. So everything seems to have worked according to the whim of the instructor at the school, who presumably used his own judgment to assess when students were ready to move up to the next level of their training. The students themselves would have come from a variety of social backgrounds during the Renaissance era. Obviously, they needed enough money to pay for the lessons and to have a sword, which would have ruled out probably most common folk. But both the gentry and the nobility would have participated in fencing lessons. Now, in the case of the nobility, the richest nobles probably paid for fencing instructors to visit them in their own homes and give them private lessons. Certainly this is alluded to in the format of some fencing treatises, which are written as a dialogue between a visiting fencing instructor and a nobleman in his house or garden. That could just be a literary device, of course, but it's my personal belief that that probably was the reality for a lot of the top level of society. However, other nobles would have paid to attend commercial fencing schools, and certainly the young men of the gentry would have learned swordsmanship this way. So the gentry was the period equivalent of the middle class. So we're talking about young men from families with a professional background. So the families of lawyers, bankers, physicians, and so on and so forth. In the Renaissance, these people were social climbers. So they were ambitious and looking to reinforce their status by aping some of the mannerisms of the nobility. And of course, carrying a sword and learning how to fence was part of that, as was participation in the honour code system, including duelling. So a lot of the gentry were very interested in that sort of thing in this period. So that gives us a kind of overview of who was in the fencing schools. So a mix, most likely, of gentry and nobility, and attending classes which were somewhat more loosely organised than a typical modern martial arts class. Now, let's talk about the teachers in the schools. So let's begin by talking about the social background of the teachers. It's my belief that the majority of fencing instructors probably also came from the gentry. That's because teaching fencing lessons was a profession, and the gentry were the professionals of the era. There would have been exceptions to this. I'm sure there were some common fencing instructors, and also there were definitely a few noble fencing instructors. but I think the majority of them would have been from the gentry. So there were people who were earning money to live through their profession, but able to mingle with the nobility to a certain extent and to be respected as expert professionals within their field. Now, let's talk about qualifications. Some fencing instructors had some kind of official external qualification from a guild or association. There are good records of fencing guilds in places like Germany and England, though they most likely existed in many other countries too. Other fencing instructors would have served a kind of apprenticeship within a fencing school and then taken over when the previous fencing teacher retired or moved on. And some of these were family businesses, most notably that of Achille Marozzo, who, let's not forget, wrote his fencing treatise specifically for his sons so they would know how to take on the family business and keep it running properly. However, many fencing instructors were probably unqualified and simply set up shop somewhere in a city and relied on their own personal reputation or word of mouth advertising from their students to attract new customers. We know that this is the case because it's quite common to read in fencing treatises the authors complaining about a lack of regulation or a lack of qualification on the part of other fencing instructors. So we know that this was a pretty common problem. That leads us on to the final point about the teachers, which is what titles they used. Most commonly in the fencing literature of the period, they are simply referred to as fencing teachers, or teachers of fence, as it would be put in Elizabethan English. Now, some of them would undoubtedly have carried the title of fencing master or master at arms, in Italian, maestro di scherma and maestro d'armi, respectively. It's not 100% clear if bearing that title was an indication of having an official license or certificate, or if it was something that was more of an honorific. One thing to note here is that in the modern world, the term master has come to mean something different from its original definition. So in the modern world, we associate it with the idea of mastery. In other words, somebody being a top-level expert in their field. So when you say the word or the phrase fencing master, people tend to get this romantic notion that it was some kind of invincible warrior who couldn't be defeated and who knew absolutely every trick and technique of the sword. This was not at all true. In the Renaissance period, and even earlier in the medieval period, a master was more or less somebody who owned and ran their own business. So, for example, a master butcher was somebody who was running a butcher's business. There were master stonemasons. Schoolmasters were the teachers in charge of educational schools. And so the profession of fencing master fits within that sphere. So it was simply somebody who owned and ran their own school. Of course, they would have required a certain level of skill to be able to do that, and they may or may not have had some kind of official external acknowledgement of their status. So when you hear the term fencing master, don't get carried away with the idea of what that means. However, regardless, it's actually more common to find the term fencing teacher in the period literature. Last thing to say is many fencing teachers came from a military background. For example, Di Grassi was almost certainly a soldier earlier in his life, and Vincentio Saviolo definitely was a soldier. However, other fencing instructors did not have military experience. For example, Camillo Agrippa was an engineer and mathematician by trade. So there were a number of different routes through which people could find themselves in the fencing profession. Okay, so let's conclude the series by talking about some of the most important things that have come up during the 3 videos. Most significantly, it's important to note that there are some things about fencing training which remain the same in the modern world as they were in the Renaissance period. But there are many things which are actually different. We use actually slightly different training equipment, the way our schools are organized are different. The mentality of the people in the schools and their own personal backgrounds were very different from that of modern practitioners. So what does this mean for our own training? Well, most of us learn swordsmanship now as a hobby, and many of the training ideas that we've developed are suitable for learning swordsmanship as a hobby. So that is totally fine. But we do need to accept the fact that the way people trained in the 16th century was clearly effective. These people were using weapons for real, and many of them would have at some point in their lives encountered real sword-based violence, whether in civilian life or military life. So they knew what they were doing, in other words, and their training methodologies were appropriate for developing the skills they needed in that real combat environment. So I think that's interesting and worth thinking about a little bit as we plan our own training schedules. What lessons can we learn from the Renaissance and bring into modern practice? And what are no longer appropriate for training in a hobby environment? All right, I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.